Okay, so when you hear the name Hammurabi, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably an eye for an eye, right? We've all got this image of brutal ancient justice carved in stone. But what if that whole picture is, well, just wrong? What if one of the oldest legal codes ever wasn't really about morality, but about something way more practical and maybe a little more cynical?
Because here's the thing, when you actually strip away all the myths and look at what's written on that 4,000-year-old slab of rock, you find a pretty uncomfortable truth. See, the Code of Hammurabi, it's not some grand moral document. It's a financial manual, and it was designed to solve a problem that, believe it or not, we're still grappling with today.
So, this is the key, right here. We've all been focused on the myth, this story about vengeance, morality, an eye for an eye. But the reality? That was all about the nuts and bolts of running an economy. We're talking loans, contracts, debt, basically figuring out who pays when things go wrong. This isn't about ethics class, it's about liability.
All right, so let's start with the myth. The image we all know and love, right? It's simple, it's cinematic, and it's just so convenient. And look, this idea of Hammurabi as this dealer of brutal, simple revenge, it's powerful. I get it. But it's just a tiny and honestly a really misleading piece of the puzzle. Here's the thing, civilizations don't usually collapse because people are bad. They collapse when their financial rules break down. And Hammurabi, he knew that. He knew it deep down.
Okay, so now let's pivot to the reality of the situation. This thing was not some deep philosophical text. Think of it more like a practical manual, a how-to guide for keeping a super volatile, fast-growing economy from completely imploding.
So the code has almost 300 different laws. And if they weren't all about, chopping off hands and poking out eyes, what in the world were they all about?
And this is the breakdown. Just look at this. An absolutely staggering 85% of his laws are about financial stuff. I'm talking interest rates, what you can use as collateral, how much people get paid, and all that famous eye for an eye business. It's that tiny little sliver over there, just 5%. 5%. It wasn't the headline, folks. It was a footnote.
See, Hammurabi's main goal wasn't about making people good people. It was about making economic outcomes predictable. You got to remember, Babylon was this huge commercial hub. You had farmers borrowing money against future harvests, merchants getting financing for long trade journeys. In that kind of world, uncertainty is your biggest enemy. So the whole point of the code was to define right up front who's on the hook when a deal goes south.
And he did this by focusing on three main things, three pillars of control. First, he had to manage debt, right? To stop some crazy debt spiral from destroying his entire agricultural base. Second, he had to enforce contracts to make sure that a deal was actually a deal. And third, he standardized wages. Why? To cut down on arguments and make the labor market run smoother.
Now, you might hear that the code did things like cap interest rates or limit how long someone could be a servant because of debt and think, oh, that's nice. But this wasn't about mercy. Not at all. It was pure, cold risk management. Think about it. Farmers who are dead or enslaved for life, they don't grow any grain. And a king with no grain isn't going to be king for very long. He wasn't protecting the poor out of the goodness of his heart. He was protecting his tax base. He was protecting the system that fed the entire empire.
And that same exact logic, it applied to contracts too. So let's say a builder's house fell down and killed the owner. The builder, well, he paid the ultimate price. Now, that sounds incredibly cruel, but it wasn't just about cruelty. It was about creating crystal clear responsibility. When you know the consequences are that severe, guess what? Builders build better houses, merchants are more careful with their goods, the whole system of trade just becomes safer. Failure had a very clear address, and everyone knew where it was.
But here's where it gets tricky. This whole system of clarity and predictability, it had another layer. And this is the part that feels really, really uncomfortable for us today. The system was designed from the ground up to be unequal, intentionally. I mean, the penalty for the exact same crime was completely different depending on your social class. And you have to understand, this wasn't some kind of hypocrisy. It wasn't a bug in the system. No, this was the system. It was the core feature. Power was written, right there in plain language, into the law, all to keep the social hierarchy exactly as it was. Just take a look at this. It shows you exactly how it worked. If a surgeon messes up and a nobleman dies, the surgeon's hands get cut off. Ouch. But if the exact same mistake kills a slave, the surgeon just has to replace the slave, like you'd replace a broken tool.
The law wasn't looking at human suffering here. It was looking at the value of a capital asset. That whole eye for an eye thing, that only applied if you were on the same social level.
So you got to ask why. Why do it this way? Well, in their minds, protecting the elites was a form of systemic risk management. If a wealthy landowner went under, that would send ripples through the whole economy, right? It would affect their tenants, the labor market, the food supply. But if one single laborer collapsed, the system would barely even notice. It was designed from the start to absorb losses at the very bottom of the pyramid to make sure everything stayed stable at the very top.
And if any of that logic starts to sound a little familiar, well, it should. Because even though the tools have gotten way more complicated, the fundamental principles of how you manage an economy, they haven't really changed that much at all.
Okay, think about this. 4,000 years ago, Hammurabi looks around and sees that a massive debt crisis could totally wreck his kingdom. So what does he do? He steps in. He intervenes. Fast forward to today. When mass defaults threaten to bring down the entire financial system, what do we get? We get central bank interventions, we get bailouts. The logic is exactly the same. When the whole thing is on the brink of collapse, the rules get bent to protect the system itself, not necessarily the individuals within it.
But there is one huge difference. Ancient Babylon was brutally honest about it. The rules, the inequality, it was all literally carved in stone for everyone to see. No hiding it. Today, our rules are buried in thousands upon thousands of pages of mind-numbingly complex legal jargon. It creates this illusion that everything's fair, while the system often operates on that same ancient logic of hierarchy and risk.
And that really brings us to the main point of all this. A lot of us look at the financial system today and we feel like it isn't moral. And maybe we're just
At the bottom,
looking for the wrong
citizens
thing.
getting
It was
austerity
never
cuts.
designed
Don't
to be
watch the
moral.
stock market.
It was designed
Watch
to
the collateral.
survive.
Ask
And for a
yourself,
system
what
to
national
survive,
assets are
someone
being
somewhere
quietly
has to
pledged
absorb
right
the
now?
losses.
Follow for
That's just
more.
how it works.
Hammurabi's code was really just an early and surprisingly honest answer to that very question. It promised order, not fairness. It made loss predictable so that the people in power could plan for it. And here we are, 4,000 years later, and that's the very same question our own super complex systems are still answering every single day, whether we can see the rules carved in stone or not.